Baby girl born into the sign of Leo made a 2-month early appearance. Maybe you liked the way the ocean felt when mommy swam backstrokes in the Pacific. Whatever it was, water broke on the ab with contractions starting 5 minutes apart. Little head lodged in my ribs, and it doesn't matter if I'm completely dilated except you're coming out too fast. Little feet dangling out to greet your daddy, and by his expression I know things have turned serious as they will me away. 19 minutes later you appeared 4 pounds 9 ounces with everything perfectly intact, Osa, and as I'm led to you. I am welcomed by your strong cries as the nurse places you on my chest. You lift your tiny head to study your mommy, and now I silently weep with utter amazement, reaching out to my pretty brown honey warrior. Malia, July 28, 1998. Chapter 1. Fatherhood in Contemporary Black America, Invisible but Present. Michael E. Connor. Emeritus, California State University, Long Beach. Joseph L. White. Emeritus, University of California, Irvine. When considering fathers and fathers' roles in the United States, the image that is usually conjured up is that of a breadwinner, disciplinarian, head of household. Those who father reside within a household that includes mother, children, and perhaps a family pet. Men who live outside the home and who father, and the manner in which they father, are routinely ignored. Allen and Connor noted in their discussion regarding generative fathering, that those men who may not be the biological father can have significant impact on children with whom they interact. To more fully, perhaps truly, understand fathering in the African American community, social scientists might need to expand the views and scopes of investigation. Also, they may have to include a focus outside the community to determine what forces control said community, i.e., educational policies, the legal system, impose limited economic opportunity, drug trade, etc. In this chapter, we discuss African American men who fulfill a fathering role, but who are not considered by those who research fathering. These males include the everyday men who are highly visible in the community, but who tend to be ignored. Some of these men have jobs, some reside in households with children, some are seen on street corners and on porches, some are in barbershops, others live with their parent or parents, some are married, some spend considerable time in church, and others put a lot of work toward honing their athletic skills. Demographic trends conceal father participation in the Black community. Historically, Black fathers have been either invisible in the study of child development and family life or characterized in negative terms such as deadbeat dads and absent fathers who are financially irresponsible and rarely involved in their children's lives. According to demographic data, most African American children growing up in contemporary society do not live in the same household with their biological fathers or reside with them only periodically. Only a minority of African American biological fathers live continuously with their children throughout childhood. Approximately 64% of African American children are growing up in one-parent households, 1/2 of Black families are headed by single mothers. Although households without the biological or legal fathers present are a growing concern in all ethnic groups in America, the problem is particularly acute in the African American community. The demographic trends outlined earlier tend to conceal the variety of ways Black men participate in the fathering experience, although they may not be legally part of the nuclear family. There seem to be major discrepancies between the negative absent father images of Black men described in demographic studies and the picture of Black men in fathering roles which emerges from structured interviews, narratives, biographical sketches, community-based observations, and ethnographic investigations. These more qualitative approaches of ordinary Black men who are not often celebrated and whose voices are seldom heard indicate that Black men have always risen to assume special places in the lives of children, families, and the Black community. In his book, Black Fatherhood, The Guide to Male Parenting, Professor Earl Afari Hutchinson, a Los Angeles-based sociologist, consultant, TV commentator, newspaper columnist and teacher, conducted extensive interviews with 5 African American men who were actively involved with their families and kids. The men who ranged in age from 26 to 88 included Hutchinson's father. The interviewees were married, single, divorced, remarried, stepfathers, grandfathers, uncles, and older brothers. Interspersed throughout the book are Hutchinson's views about his life experiences as a son and as a father who has been married, divorced, single, and remarried. The men challenged the image of Black fathers as irresponsible by highlighting what they were doing right as African American males to enrich family life and support their children's healthy development. There was a consensus among the fathers about the importance of education, teaching values, guiding children through the pitfalls of sex, gangs and drugs, and developing constructive family and marital conflict resolution strategies. The core of the men's psychological strengths were anchored in African American cultural values such as spirituality, improvisation, resilience, and connectedness to others through the extended family and the larger African American community. Commitment, Fatherhood in Black America, a book of photo essays and brief biological sketches of black men in fathering roles, shows another side to the negative images of black men as fathers. The aim of Commitment is to represent black fathers performing responsibly at work, church, play, and in family and community settings. Young fathers, old fathers, single fathers, not married fathers, and fathers across a range of different socioeconomic levels are presented as supportive, nurturing men who don't conform to stereotypical views of African American fathers. One of the stories highlighted in Commitment is that of a widowed elderly great-grandfather who is raising his 10-year-old great-grandson alone. The great-grandfather is a retired farm laborer, who worked in a grove 6 days a week for 50 years picking oranges by hand, fertilizing trees, and pulling moss off trees. He raises his great-grandson with faith in God, a structured life with clear rules, and passes along the wisdom that can only come from life experiences. The great-grandfather feels the boy has filled his life with joy and purpose. Ira Thomas, in interviews conducted for his doctoral dissertation at Harvard with a sample of 26 middle school African American boys, confirmed the presence of black male adults in father figure roles. The youth provided information about their social network of relationships with adult African Americans, the meaning of the relationships in their lives, and how relationships with adult males guided their behavior, values, and goals for the future. Using a combination of qualitative and quantitative data analysis methods, the author uncovered 5 basic dimensions that characterize the relationship between the boys and the adult men in their networks: relationship ideal or closeness of the relationship, physical presence, empowerment, communication, and teaching and learning. The boys described the relationships with adult males as being tight. They valued spending time together, active engagement, instructive talk about conflict resolution, emotional and social support, and learning about life and family values from the experiences of the adults. The adult men in whom the boys shared rich relationships involved older friends, uncles, adult cousins, ministers, godfathers, stepfathers, coaches, older brothers, and some biological fathers. Social fatherhood in the African American community. Some of the confusion about fathering in the African American community is due to the lack of a clear definition of what a father is or is not. Traditional definitions of fatherhood underestimate the role of black fathers and do not adequately capture the cultural nuances that surround the fathering role in the African American experience. A more fluent and inclusive term is needed to capture the essence of the fathering role in African American social and family networks. Coley and others use the term social fatherhood to include men who assume some or all of the roles fathers are expected to perform in a child's life, whether or not they are biological fathers. As a more inclusive term, social fatherhood encompasses biological fathers, but also extends to men who are not biological fathers who provide a significant degree of nurturance, moral and ethical guidance, companionship, emotional support, and financial responsibility in the lives of children. Because of high rates of divorce, out-of-wedlock births, separation, dissociation and reconstruction of families, more men are assuming father-like roles to children who are not their biological offspring. Black youth are well aware of the impact of social fathers in their lives. For example, in a recent research study, when African American girls were asked to name a man who was most like their father to me, 24% of the respondents named a non-biological father. Similar rates of non-biological father involvement have been reported in other studies. In his research with black adolescent boys reviewed earlier, Thomas found that many of the adults which the youth shared rich relationships with were not their biological fathers. An example is the case of BJ. At 12, BJ was heading for trouble. He was residing with his father in a high-crime area in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, his father was unable to provide proper support or supervision, and BJ was having difficulties at home, at school, and in the community. Soon, the Department of Social Services revoked custody from the father, and BJ and a younger sister were sent to live with their half-brother, a former Marine. The older brother had gone through a period of adjustment as he was growing up, and the Marines had helped to get him on track. He was concerned that his younger siblings were experiencing some of the issues he had gone through and thought he had the responsibility to help them. Although the older brother was married with 2 young children and lived in a 2-bedroom apartment, he willingly accepted the younger siblings into his home. BJ now had rules, responsibilities, and structure. He wanted to be treated like a man, but had no sense of discipline or integrity. He now had to earn things. 5 years later, BJ is a senior at a local high school where he is a solid student and a gifted football player, quarterback, who has received scholarship offers from several Division I programs. He matured into a trustworthy, respectful 17-year-old under his brother's guidance. BJ states, "If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be here. I'd be locked up or dead. I can't thank him enough for allowing me to become the person I am." BJ's biological father is thankful that his younger son was placed with his older son. Although letting his son go was a painfully difficult task, the father recognized he was not up to the task of properly rearing his children. He was able to maintain contact with BJ over the years and is very supportive of his son's activities. BJ is not upset with or critical of his biological father. He says, "I don't want to tell you he's a bad person because he's not. I love my father to death. He wasn't ready for it." As relates to his brother, BJ says, "My brother has taught me to be a man. I don't know how to explain it, but it's great." The overlapping community, social, and family networks that make up the extended family in the African American community have always been a primary source of social fatherhood. The extended family provided a plethora of men as uncles, godfathers, brothers and half-brothers, cousins, stepfathers, ministers, grandfathers, and biological fathers who assumed the responsibility for raising children. Most African American men learned the meaning of fatherhood through a circle of kin networks and community affiliations that provided a variety of men to be observed and emulated and from whom a frame of reference for viewing the world could be acquired. Through interactions of extended family members, young men have the opportunity to practice fathering by caring for younger siblings and participating in decision-making. Social fathers as extended family members can augment the biological father role and provide adequate role models when the biological fathers are absent. The African American Extended Family System. The origins of the African American extended family system can be traced back to Africa before Africans were enslaved in the New World. In the traditional African kinship network, guiding children did not only rest with the biological parents, but was also part of communal responsibility. Throughout childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood, African youth were surrounded by a network of adults in the family and community who took on the responsibility for teaching values that involved collective survival, building harmonious relationships, spirituality, and respect for others. The ancient African proverb states that it takes a village to raise a child. Despite centuries of slavery, de facto and de jure segregation, economic depressions, the rural to urban migration, and continuing traces of racism which are evident in employment, education, and the legal system, the African American cultural values, which are the foundation of the African American family, have persisted. Historically, in the communal tradition of African American life, powerful black males were looked upon as role models and father figures. Men like Nat Turner, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Malcolm X, Jackie Robinson, Frederick Douglass, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Richard Wright, and Ralph Ellison, as well as church deacons, older black men sitting on the bench in parks, and the community elders who carried the hopes and aspirations of the African American community were claimed as father figures for their strength and commitment to uplifting the race. Changing definitions of fatherhood. Not only has the definition of who should be included in the term fatherhood changed, there is also a growing lack of agreement among experts on the primary role of fathers in America. In the early history of America, Euro-American fathers were depicted as stern, emotionally insulated, moral overseers who autocratically ruled their wives and children with an iron hand. The new Euro-American fathers who have appeared in popular culture in the last 25 years are buddies with children, diaper changers, childbirth attendants, nursery school volunteers, and supportive companions to mom. The so-called new nurturant father is closely attuned to the needs of his children, offers hugs and expressions of affection, listens, reads bedtime stories, and is democratic and patient. The new dads are likely to be highly educated men living in the suburbs, which suggests that cultural and economic forces are shaping images of modern fatherhood. Despite the apparent changes in fatherhood roles, the economic provider role, which has always been dominant throughout Euro-American history, remains central to most definitions of fatherhood. Deadbeat dads who do not financially support their children or cannot master the breadwinner role are not held in high esteem in any segment of American society. Because black men have always been connected to two cultural arenas in America, African American and Euro-American, they are, no doubt, influenced by dominant cultural definitions of fatherhood roles. Historically, black men in America have experienced a dual cultural consciousness. The great African American civil rights leader and social philosopher, W. E. B. Du Bois spoke of this duality as a two-ness, a double consciousness, feeling part of America and its values, yet excluded from full participation in mainstream America. With respect to fatherhood roles, the majority of black males understand and accept the provider or breadwinner role. Hunter and Davis, 1994. The dilemma for African American men is how to overcome the structural and institutional barriers that inhibit landing, keeping, and being promoted on jobs that pay the kind of wages that can support a family. Ethnographic research suggests that for many young inner-city African American fathers, even strong motivation to provide for or do for their children is difficult to sustain when fathers face bleak employment prospects because of a dearth of jobs combined with inadequate educational preparation in ghetto schools. Faced with dim employment prospects to support their children, some young black fathers get caught up in the consequences of maladaptive choices. With drugs as the largest economy in the inner cities, it is not difficult to get caught up in drug business transactions that pay more than minimum wage jobs. As anyone can see who visits America's prisons or urban courts, thousands of black men are caught up in the drug economy, which has consequences that further restrict their ability as providers. Dropping out of the work world or not contributing at all to economically provide for one's children will bring censure from the courts and the community. To resolve the duality of being part of two cultures and perform effectively as breadwinners, African American men must draw on African cultural strengths which have sustained us from slavery, through the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Great Migration to urban America, and the Civil Rights Movement. Additionally, we may want to more fully examine Du Bois' two-ness, referred to here as biculturalism, mentioned earlier. One can argue that regardless of the level of knowledge, having some, even limited, bicultural ability has value over being limited to monocultural skills. Thus, what has too often been considered a weakness or a deficit may in fact be a strength. One possibility deriving from this perspective is that we likely know more about the wider community than the wider community knows about us, and we have survived in the face of enormous obstacles. We likely do not use this knowledge to our individual or collective advantage. Perhaps we might consider redefining ourselves, as a people, as fathers, from a position of positive affirmation. The implications of such a redefinition can be considerable. These cultural and psychological strengths, which will be discussed in greater detail in the last section of this book, involve spirituality, resilience, collective survival through extended family networks, emotional vitality, and the ability to keep on keeping on in the face of adversity. Father Need. In his book, Father Need, Kyle Pruitt, a child psychiatrist, who is a senior staff member at the Yale Child Guidance Center, uses the term father need to describe the powerful physical, psychological, and emotional force that pulls men to children, related or not, just as it pulls children to men to shape, enrich, and expand each other's lives. According to Pruitt, there is a deep need in men to provide fathering and a need in their children to experience it. Father presence offers children the opportunity to interact with the essence of maleness, the voice rhythms and sounds, smells, texture, body size, and the difference between male and female bodies. The need for fathers in children is so strong that they may make up imaginary fathers when they don't have one or spend a lot of energy looking for a replacement. Some children successfully build close relationships or become tight with uncles, grandfathers, coaches, preachers, or good friends of mom. The urban middle school African American boys interviewed in Thomas' doctoral dissertation, who did not have biological fathers in the home, established close relationships with surrogate fathers in their social networks. The rich relationships which the boys shared with the men fulfilled father need with emotional and social support, quality time spent together, teaching and instructive talk, and guidance about sex and drugs, problem solving, and family values. Through these high-quality interpersonal relationships, boys were developing confidence and the skills they need to negotiate the transition through their adolescent to adult years. Father need is central to the father's growth and happiness. A critical turning point in life occurs when a man becomes a father. Guiding and caring for children is not only developmentally and psychologically important to the child, but is central to the father's psychological growth and well-being. In the father-child dyad, change is constant and complex. Children and parents go through psychological developmental stages and transitions and are constantly in a process of becoming. Fathers are changed by children as much as children are changed by parents. Ongoing reciprocal transitions between father and child fuel the development of each and power them forward in life. The transition into mature paternal identity can only be achieved by active and sustained emotional engagement. To become good enough fathers, men must make a conscious effort to shift their internal psychological world and external behavior to become involved in daily close interactions with children. Successful fathers need to continuously strive to develop behaviors that promote the well-being of others, such as emotional openness, nurturance, patience, compassion, a willingness to love others despite their imperfections, and the ability to sacrifice personal needs for the good of others. Fathers who take responsibility for their children report that it makes them more complete people by providing them with the opportunities to develop more affectionate and feeling sides of themselves. Generative fathering. Erik Erikson coined the term generativity to refer to an emergent process that accentuates parents' personal growth in relation to their children's well-being. As the primary psychological task of healthy adulthood, generative fathers have a genuine commitment to establishing and guiding the next generation. Erikson believed that in order to become fully human, a father must widen his commitment beyond the self and invest in caring deeply for others. Generative fathering includes any nurturing activity that contributes to the life of the next generation, such as the development or creation of more mature persons, products, ideas, or works of art. The essence of generativity is contributing to and renewing the ongoing cycle of generations. Erikson believed that men can and want to become the kinds of fathers their children need them to be, and that the renewal of society calls for non-self-absorbed adults who are prepared to help establish the next generation of adults, products, ideas, and works of art. The black men interviewed by sociologist Earl Hutchinson accepted generative fathering as the primary developmental task of their adult lives. Whether married, single, divorced, or remarried, they were very committed to behaving responsibly toward their children, being emotionally and physically available, and providing material support to take care of their children's needs. Embedded in family and community networks, they taught their children the importance of being bicultural and how to survive in mainstream society with a strong sense of the power of the African American heritage, with its emphasis on spirituality, extended family, resilience, and emotional vitality. Studies of inner-city African American fathers suggest that even when only marginally involved, fatherhood is a critical element in their sense of self. Many of these fathers told investigators that becoming a father was a life-changing experience, leading them to drastically cut down illegal, dangerous, and high-risk activities. Fathering gave them a reason to live and the motivation to work toward personal redefinition and transformation. There is no complete blueprint for learning how to be a generative father. Initially, behavioral psychologists emphasized that men constructed their fatherhood identities by following cultural scripts and modeling and imitating concrete male figures in fathering roles. Generative fathering in some men is, no doubt, influenced by recollections of the fathers they experienced as children, as well as cultural patterns and observations of other boys' fathers in specific situations. However, more recent social constructionist theories view generative fathering as a discovery process. A man actively shapes his role as a father through improvisation, reformulation, and creatively piecing together bits and pieces of fathering behavior from personal history and social situations. Ethnographic research conducted by Daly suggests that men in modern American society regard their fathers not as role models, but as a point of reference to begin sorting out in what ways they want to be different. Rather than patterning their behavior after a specific individual or cultural script, the men in Daly's study selected particular behaviors from a wide variety of parenting behaviors around them, including wives and mothers. Creating their own pattern of fatherhood by emulating desirable parental behaviors from many adults allowed the men to be more innovative and flexible with their own children in terms of discipline, guidelines for behavior, setting goals, and learning to listen to the voices and needs of their children before autocratically making decisions. Learning to be fathers. Although young black men understandably need the guidance and intimacy which generations of black fathers can provide, many urban black men begin the fathering process without the benefit of close bonds with men in fathering roles. Leonard Pitts, an African American author and journalist, begins his journey into fatherhood as the son of an abusive, alcoholic father who dropped out of the workforce as a young adult. In the journey to discovering his fatherhood identity, Pitts followed the social constructionist model. As he struggled with doubts that he was doing it right as a father, Pitts interviewed several friends, neighbors, and acquaintances about their experiences as sons and fathers. The African American men he interviewed across the country were businessmen, teachers, coaches, playboys, students, preachers, ex-convicts, in-residence fathers, and fathers living away from their children. From the men's fathering stories and his own experiences, Pitts pieced together an integrative pattern of what he wanted to become as a generative father to his 2 stepchildren and 3 biological children. Pitts discovered that the strongest influence in his paternal style was his mother, who held the family together through the years of his father's abuse, alcoholism, and voluntary unemployment. Unfulfilled father need: searching, understanding, forgiving, and reconciliation. When father need is unfulfilled because of father abuse, alcoholism, father absence, or emotional distance between children and biological, social, or surrogate fathers, children experience an emotional void, which they carry into adulthood. In Father Songs, a book about African American father stories edited by Gloria Wade Gales, many prominent male and female African American authors discuss the emotional emptiness and psychological scars they carried into adulthood as a result of unfulfilled father need. The stories of unfulfilled father need follow a similar sequence. As the authors move through adulthood, rage, disappointment, and feelings of rejection are supplanted by a need to understand and reconnect with fathers. In his book, Notes of a Native Son, prize-winning author James Baldwin wrote about his struggle to get behind the mask of his abusive, psychologically withdrawn stepfather and understand the deeper layers of the man. At his stepfather's funeral, Baldwin listened pensively as the minister described a man quite the opposite of the man Baldwin and his siblings had known. The minister presented the stepfather as the ideal generative father, a thoughtful, patient, Christian nurturing man who successfully built his life around his family and children. As Baldwin peered into the casket, he wondered if the minister had captured the true essence of the man that was hidden beneath layers of rage, poverty, and disappointment brought on by racial oppression, which psychologically destroyed many black fathers in the first half of the 20th century. Beyond the facts of his stepfather's life, what was the real identity of the man who had lived, died, and now was being eulogized? Several of the writers in Wade Gale's book actively searched for a deeper understanding of their fathers by visiting the communities where their fathers were reared and talked to relatives and friends of their fathers. Others searched their memories for happy times beneath the cloud of rage and disappointment. Some set up face-to-face meetings with their fathers or trips with fathers to weddings, funerals, and family gatherings in fathers' hometowns, which were mostly in southern states. Leonard Pitts, who grew up in Los Angeles, traveled to Mississippi to conduct extensive interviews with his father's relatives and friends. John Edgar Wideman, an African-American college professor in Massachusetts, visits his father's boyhood home in South Carolina and later attends a family wedding reunion with his father. As sons like Leonard Pitts and John Edgar Wideman begin to understand the oppressive racial conditions which shaped their fathers' lives as African-American men in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, they gradually back up from harsh criticism and bitter anger. It was not easy for their fathers to struggle with low-paying, exhausting jobs, if employed at all, in factories, foundries, shining shoes, hauling trash, cleaning buildings, sharecropping, and laying railroad tracks. Police brutality, substandard housing, lack of adequate health care, long jail sentences for minor offenses, poor education, and de facto and de jure segregation, North and South, contributed to the frustration and psychological destruction of many black fathers. James Baldwin warns us not to judge black men too harshly who may have fallen under such heavy burdens. Understanding their fathers allowed the authors to see fresh meaning in their fathers' lives and have faith that their fathers did the best they could to be good fathers before they were derailed and sometimes even crushed by impossible burdens. Understanding is followed by forgiveness and attempts at reconciliation and establishing new connections with father. Leonard Pitts has a heart-to-heart talk with his father before he dies. His father confesses his mistakes and asks for forgiveness. After his father's death, Pitts experiences a catharsis which leads to reconciliation and healing when he cries at his father's grave and later writes a letter to his deceased father sharing his feelings. Once free of the anger, resentment, hunger, and searching for father, black men are psychologically liberated from the father need chains of the past and free to start learning to be generative fathers. Conclusion: There is little doubt that too many black children reside in single-parent, low-income homes and have limited meaningful interactions and relationships with men as fathers. However, in numerous situations, black men are present in the lives of children, yet they are ignored and their contributions minimized. These men's roles and the importance of their interactions tend to be absent in too many discussions of fathers and fatherhood. Although the manner in which these men father may differ from notions, perceptions, and standards of traditional fathering, their contributions are invaluable and have impact on their children. These actions and their impact tend to be ignored, missed, discarded, and devalued. These African American men in father roles love, care for, and desire interactions with their children. Most tend to provide financially, as their employment circumstances dictate. It is important to acknowledge these men and the principles, which they indicate, are important as they interact with children, i.e., the teaching of values, providing guidance, and supporting education. By so doing, the actions are reinforced, making them more likely to be brought to the attention of other men. Clearly, children across ages, sons and daughters, want and need relationships with men in fathering capacities. Creating and perpetuating barriers to father-child relationship can only further erode the very fabric of community growth and success. Ignoring these men is short-sighted and destructive. By acknowledging the important contribution of these involved African American men, the very definition father will be expanded to more accurately depict what black fathers are and what they do. The concepts of social fatherhood, generative fathering, and father need are important in this paradigm shift. This more complete analysis of black men will likely demonstrate that some of the men who were not involved with their children were not deadbeat per se, but were men bearing both psychological and physical scars derived from daily interactions in an oppressive environment. The ugly remnants of these scars were passed on to their offspring in terms of an emotional distance between fathers and children. Men such as John Edgar Wideman and Leonard Pitts, aware of the rage, disappointment, and feelings of rejection, made a conscious decision to understand and reconnect with their fathers. In so doing, they discovered and began to comprehend the oppressive conditions under which their fathers lived. This awareness and insight allowed Wideman and Pitts to see their fathers in a different light, permitting a healing process to begin. Without the realization of the need to understand what these older black men were forced to go through, it is likely impossible to let go of the anger and rage felt by Wideman and Pitts. This letting go allowed the healing to commence so these younger men could move on in their lives, making it more likely they would become more competent and involved fathers themselves. Knowledge and forgiveness are powerful tools for emotional healing in a spiritual people. Clearly, traditional definitions of fatherhood cannot and do not reflect cultural aspects of what black men do as fathers. The variety of skills, activities, and interactions demonstrated by black men are not adequately conveyed. In summary, we note that black men are often present in children's lives, however, they are usually ignored or their roles minimized by those outside the community. The manner in which these men parent often differs from traditional fathering, and thus is discarded and devalued. Data clearly suggests that African American men in fathering roles love, care for, and desire interaction with their children. No doubt, too many African American children reside in single-parent homes, yet men are present. We must find ways to acknowledge and show value for these men. Skills and behaviors which these fathers indicate are important to them as they interact with children include the teaching of values, providing guidance and supporting education. Data also suggests children, both sons and daughters, want and need relationships with men. Thus, we must consider expanding definitions of what black fathers are and what they do, especially social fatherhood. It is clear that traditional definitions do not reflect interactions and activities engaged in by black